Okay. Well, thanks for sitting down with us today, Dr. Hudson. It's really exciting to talk with you. So, my first question will just be sort of about there was a book that you were sort of an editor for called The Middle East Dilemma a few years ago, we'll say. And in it, you kind of noted a well-known theory by Professor Deutsch, who's kind of a very well-known political scientist. And in it, you talked about his two notions of integration versus amalgamation. So this is around this idea of like, what kind of unity will there be in the Middle East? Will there ever be kind of a united Middle East, and what would that look like? And so in it, I'll just give some definitions just to clarify for people. And integration was more about this sense of community and norms of peace, whereas amalgamation was an actual kind of creating of a new state under kind of one formal government. So I bring this up because this seems to be a consistent theory or sort of idea or maybe projection of some of the groups that are involved in the conflict in Syria that's now kind of moved throughout the region. These notions of unification or maybe separation into smaller states. And I was just wondering if you think this is a useful framework to look at it. Do you think that this is an ultimate goal? Sort of, what is your today take on notions of integration?
Well, I think what the Middle East badly needs is some kind of a regional organization that actually functions and that works and that can set a kind of norm for more stable interactions in a region that is, of course, as we all know, is just full of conflicts. Yeah. Interstate conflicts, transnational conflicts, intrastate conflicts, and so forth. I mean, the Middle East we're looking at now is highly volatile, and the idea of a unified, let alone amalgamated, Arab world or Middle East seems extremely far away. I mean, in terms of the framework that Professor Deutsch, who happened many years ago to be my PhD supervisor at Yale, in terms of that framework, the idea of an amalgamated superstate, you know, on the model, say, of the United States of America, which is an amalgamated entity, is, you know, very, very far off indeed. And I think, you know, the best that one can hope for at this stage is some kind of expanded regional cooperation, a level of integration, and very loose integration at that. The regional organizations that exist now in the Middle East, of course, there's the Arab League, the League of Arab States, which over its long history, it goes back to 1945, has not done a lot. And in the key areas where you would expect integration to move to something tighter and more unified, such as defense cooperation and so forth, or budgetary or economic union, the results have been pretty poor. The other major regional organization is a smaller one, and that's the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, which comprises the 6 Arab states of the Gulf. Very small states except for Saudi Arabia, which is a medium-sized state. And the GCC has made certain progress, but again, not in the really sensitive areas. They have not been able, for example, to organize a unified defense force, even though when the troubles broke out in Bahrain in 2011, the Peninsula Shield Force, it was called, intervened, but it was basically Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. It wasn't really a GCC thing. But nevertheless, the GCC has promoted certain kinds of cultural and social infrastructure integration to a modest extent. But when you look at the Middle East as a whole, which is a region that is united in a sense paradoxically by conflict, the big powers in the larger Middle East, as conventionally understood, are actually not Arab states at all. They are Israel, Turkey, and Iran. And none of those states are involved in any kind of regional organization. Back about 15 years ago or so, when the Oslo process, when it looked like there was going to be possibly real Palestinian Arab-Israeli peace, if the process had worked, which it didn't. But at that time, the one-time Prime Minister of Israel, Shimon Peres, published a book called The New Middle East. This was, of course, from an Israeli perspective, which envisioned, once the Palestine matter was sort of settled, a larger Middle East, Israel definitely included, which would have economic integration, which there would be, lowering of immigration and trade and tariff barriers and so forth, which is a nice idea. But of course, since the Palestine problem is far from being settled so far, that's just a theoretical blueprint. So on the whole, the Middle East region is a region that is defined in a way more by crises and conflict than by actual positive unity.
And cooperation and interaction.
It's there in certain places. I mean, I don't want to minimize the fact that they're on the level of what regional integration theorists used to call functional integration. There are, this is particularly true in the Arab world, where there are many professional and functional organizations, from sports federations to professional groups like engineers and lawyers and so forth, that do meet. And of course, the other really interesting phenomenon that has made at least the Arab region more of a sort of socially coherent region is the information technology revolution and the coming of Al Jazeera, the coming of satellite television, the rise of social media in Arabic that I think has engendered a kind of connectivity and sort of deepening or reconstructing or constructing of identity that wasn't there before. And that's all beneath the political radar. That's quite interesting.
Yeah, well, it leads me to a question that I think does come up, although maybe it's just for people sort of interested in notions of regional power and whatnot. But it's always seemed to me that there's a competition for sort of who's the regional leader. And as far as political science studies go, the Middle East is that one region where you can't pick one as the clear kind of regional leader. And I was wondering if you sort of see one state emerging, or if you think that a lot of the proxy issues related to Syria are tied into these notions of states competing for regional power, regional status.
Well, there's a history to this. Back, when would it have been? In the 1960s, a one-time friend and colleague of mine, Leonard Binder, from the University of Chicago, then at UCLA, wrote a very interesting essay in which he argued that the Middle East was what he called a subordinate international system, and that it was emerging in a sense as something unto itself. In other words, moving from an area that had been essentially manipulated from outside by external forces into something that had a little coherence of its own. Well, I mean, that's an interesting and complicated argument considering the things we were just talking about, but it raised the question, if this is a kind of a regional subsystem, what kind of a system actually is it? And in terms of classical international relations theory, if you were trying to imagine what the balance of power is in this region, or if you were trying to identify the nature of the relationships of states within the region, what exactly would it be? Well, clearly, whatever it was, it has changed over time. But there certainly was a time back, indeed, in the 1950s and 60s when nationalism was a big force, and when Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt sort of embodied in his charismatic self the idea of Arab unity propelled by the biggest Arab state in the region, which was, of course, was Egypt. You might have said back then that the Arab state system, leave aside the non-Arab Middle East for a moment, was dominated by Egypt. And you might have said for a time that Egypt was a kind of hegemonic power. It didn't run the system, but it was clearly the main driver. And according to, of course, classical IR theory, many of the smaller states would then try to band together to prevent Egypt from sort of swallowing them up. And then, therefore, for a long time, you had a system which Egypt dominated, but there was a counter coalition led by the conservative monarchies, or what from an America-centric point of view, we would have called the moderate Arab states, tried to contain Egypt, or to prevent Egypt and the vision of pan-Arabism a la Nasser, driven by hegemonic Egypt, that we have to put limits on that. And of course, finally they did. Well, that's a long way of sort of getting us to fast forward to the present, where I think you'd have to say that the region today is not, there is not a hegemon, there's not a regional hegemon at all at the moment. Egypt, of course, has faded dramatically as a regional power ever since Camp David, ever since Sadat, ever since Egypt for quite a long time was shunned by the rest of the Arab world because of the peace treaty with Israel. And then for all sorts of economic and other reasons, the locus of power, or at least the locus of influence, shifted more toward the Gulf. But today, I mean, you would have to say that the Gulf states, while they are economically very dominant and powerful, but these are small places in terms of population. I mean, Saudi Arabia has 20 million people, and the 5 other little countries are, 1 million here, 2 million there, 500,000. They're small places. They're big economically, but you can't really say that they are regional superpowers. Saudi Arabia, with all the money that it has and with all of the military equipment that it has purchased mostly from the United States up till now, cannot be said to be sort of assertive. Saudi Arabia, in fact, is sort of permanently defensive, and that's why they are so worried about Iran, and so lately very upset, I think, that there might be a kind of a détente between America and plus the European powers and Iran. It really bothers them. But so what do you have? I think you have, you don't have a dominant state within the Arab world. GCC would like to play that, but how much hard power does it really have? So you look to the non-Arab Middle East, and that's, of course, where there is substantial size, heft, power, and that, of course, resides in Israel, Turkey, and Iran. Israel having a very small country, of course, but having a military establishment and some 200 nuclear weapons, so it has to be considered, something special in the region. Turkey and Iran, each with very, very substantial populations, resources, and so forth. But none of them really can dominate this region, as we have seen. There was a moment not long ago when it looked as if Turkey, under Erdogan and the AK party, a sort of soft Islamist party, were kind of riding an Islamic wave. And it looked for a while, it doesn't look this way at the moment, but it looked for a while as if Turkey was setting itself up as a kind of a model, even for Arab states, which of course traditionally have felt that Ottoman domination in the past, was something, it wasn't exactly colonialism, but something they wanted, not to have much to do with. But Turkey was there. And then, of course, there was Iran, and especially after the Islamic Revolution in 1979, when Iran tried to project itself as the new guy on the block, a system challenger indeed, carrying the flag of Islam. The problem was, even though they tried to present themselves as a kind of an Islamic ecumenical force, not Shiite, that is to say, that really didn't work. And of course, the way things have evolved at the present time, we see a very unhealthy reconstruction or construction of Sunni Shia hostility. And that in a way, prevents Iran from sort of dominating the scene. Of course, there are all sorts of other reasons why Iran doesn't dominate the scene. So in what you're looking at today, I think you have to call it a multipolar system, and a system that is still substantially affected by, I wouldn't say manipulated by anymore. I think Binder was right in this sense, that it has sort of autonomy unto itself, but still very much affected by the larger global balance of power. And that raises, of course, an extremely interesting question that is much debated. I know we're at the Middle East Institute in Singapore, at the National University of Singapore, and we've had, of course, good cooperation with Arizona. But there's much talk there and throughout Asia about the decline of America. And so if you shift your focus from the regional balance of power, which I think has become essentially multipolar and not terrifically stable, I might add, to the global balance, here again there's, I think, clearly a shift away from what we in the United States considered, America as the indispensable nation, as America as the hegemon in the world, and certainly in the Middle East, with an American military presence practically everywhere surrounding the contentious, volatile Middle East. But you'd have to say lately that the ascendancy of America is something past. And what we've seen, and very recently, I think, with the Syrian conflict, with the American ambivalent response to the Arab uprisings, and with the effort now very suddenly to have an interim kind of détente with Iran, you're looking, I think, at the United States and the Obama administration saying, well, we've got other fish to fry. The Middle East is important, but do we really need to try to run the place? We haven't been terrifically successful at this in the past. So we're sharing. And I think the interim arrangement with Iran over its nuclear facilities and the question of sanctions is not an American show altogether. It's the P5+1. It's the Security Council members plus Germany who have come together to do this. And in a sense, it's a sign that the United States can't just sort of run the Middle East. And the one area where the United States has insisted that it alone can really handle a conflict is, of course, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And that remains to be seen. It's a process, if you can call it that, that's up in the air. But my own feeling is that if there's a growing trend toward multipolarity at the global level as well as the regional level, maybe it's not such a bad thing. And maybe a Palestinian-Israeli peace, if it's ever to come, ought to be managed not just by the United States, but by the larger Western community as well.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up multipolarity, because I guess it was a year or more ago, famed Professor Kenneth Waltz, wrote an article in Foreign Affairs talking about why it would actually be good for Iran to, he framed it as have the bomb, but to continue kind of the nuclear development. And that was largely because he's the balance of power theorist, and so his notion was you're bringing actual balance to a system that's volatile, largely because you had at one point kind of one country with a lot of power and hostile relations with kind of all the others. So I was just wondering what you think about, do you think that this kind of confirms that his notion of that it is bringing balance to the region, or is it something else? It's just sort of an additional add-on.
Well, I should say, first of all, full confession, I was a student of Kenneth Waltz.
I know.
And a long time ago, before he went to Columbia and Berkeley, he was teaching at Swarthmore, and I was an undergraduate there.
Yeah.
So I grew up on Man, the State, and War, his classic book. And of course, I read with great interest his article, which was quite a blockbuster.
Yeah.
Let them have the bomb, but it was fully consistent, with his very parsimonious, elegant, logical concept of the nature of international relations. And I have to say, makes complete sense to me. Why not? I mean, first of all, the whole issue of the existential threat to Israel if Iran got a bomb, I think is totally misconstrued, misconceived. I mean, even if they were to get the bomb, if they got one or two, you would have to assume that they were a totally failed state, or they were totally crazy people, and a lot of kind of racism and Islamophobia plays into the way this is presented in public. But I mean, suppose they had it. So what? Well, we're nowhere near that. I mean, the framework of public debate on this is, well, how do we keep them from, slow them down from the ability to make one of these bombs, which they will probably get eventually, sooner or later anyway. But not that I think it should matter so much. But in the narrow day-to-day world, of course, it matters a hell of a lot to the Israelis and a hell of a lot to the Saudis. And it is really, I mean, if you have a taste for irony, it is a little bit ironical to find that the Saudis and the Israelis seem to be brothers in arms, as it were, when it comes to the question of Iranian nuclear weapons. But I mean, Waltz's argument was, it was a provocation. It was provocative, but I think it was salutary. Netanyahu said, "This must be the stupidest professor that ever, walked the halls of Ivy." But of course, you'd expect him to say that. Yeah. But he said it, and the question really is, would it really matter? And that raises the larger question of, what does having, a huge amount of really hard power matter in the modern world anyway? Israel, of course, with they say 200 nuclear devices and the missiles with which they can, or the aircraft with which they can deliver them, what good has it done them? Has it significantly enhanced Israel's security? It seems not. And it seems, in a way, to have a huge amount of power can sometimes paradoxically bring you more insecurity, or at least prevent you from having the security you would have thought it should buy. And there they are, to this very day, still feeling under siege, concerned, about this and that. Their immediate concerns, of course, are not somebody else's nuclear weapons, but the people next door with Scud missiles or variations on them that are, surrounding them. So it is odd indeed, when you consider the question of power. What does it really mean, and where does it get you? So in some ways, Israel, with huge amounts of power that it cannot effectively deploy to provide it peace and quiet and normality, that's one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is, Saudi Arabia, which has an awful lot of oil and an awful lot of money. It can buy, all the weapons it thinks it needs, although it has a very limited capacity actually to use these weapons. I am told that there are still highly advanced weapons that have been bought from the United States that are still in crates sitting in warehouses without people able really to deploy them. But again, the question is, how do you convert potential hard power into actual security? And this, Saudis must feel, despite a certain kind of chauvinism that you sense in Saudi Arabia and the GCC, that we're really somebody, and you should pay attention to us. They're still, deep insecurity, I think, because they have the weapons, but they don't have the manpower, they don't have the technology, and they don't have. I mean, what they do have, is vast spaces, long borders, with a lot of problematic things happening on all their borders. And they're, So they're kind of stuck, and that's why they have been so, what would you say, uncharacteristically petulant about a possible deal with Iran, and why they have been so unhappy that the United States has not done what they themselves would like to do but can't, which is, go into Syria with boots on the ground and get rid of Bashar al-Assad, and break up the sort of the Shiite alliance that they see as threatening their sort of world, Sunni world. I mean, I don't think people until quite recently thought of sort of their world as Sunni over there, but now the discourse is very much, framed in these kind of sectarian terms. But you can have all the sort of the sinews or the potentialities to have real power, but do you really have it? And the answer is, well, no. And so we have a very, a system. We don't. The key question, I think, now is this emerging multipolar regional system, multipolar global system, are these systems which interact with each other in unpredictable ways, are these systems really stable balances of power or unstable? And it's a little bit hard to know, where things are going. And that's partly because, in addition to the sort of, the classical international relations approach, the state-centered approach, state-centered analysis approach, it's all complicated by the fact that what Waltz once called the sort of second-level analysis domain, that is to say, the domain of society and state, has become so unstable itself in many parts of the region. So we can't assume in the kind of classical way that states are little black boxes that respond to their rationally conceived interest and security concerns, because inside the box there's a lot of ferment going on, and that adds another dimension of uncertainty to the whole situation.
There are some cracks in some of the boxes, one might say.
You might say that. You might say that.
Well, I'll just ask you one last question, and it's the question everyone asks and nobody wants to answer. But what do you sort of see as maybe a best outcome or a possible outcome in Syria, given that it is such an important aspect of the Middle East, of the regional setup? What are your thoughts on kind of the outcomes?
Well, I mean, first of all, my feelings, and I think my feelings are the feelings of almost everybody who has, been looking at Syria, or who is a Syrian who has been in Syria at a slow motion train wreck, an ongoing catastrophe, a humanitarian catastrophe, a political catastrophe, a moral catastrophe, and one just doesn't quite know how to, comprehend this beyond sort of wringing of hands, which seems totally inadequate given the ghastly humanitarian dimensions of this conflict. But in terms of how we looked at it, I think I looked at it initially, first of all, as part of this kind of contagion effect, if you will, without being pejorative, of the popular uprisings that had happened in Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Yemen, with reverberations in many other Arab countries, which certainly, in the early part of 2011, seemed clearly to be spontaneous and directed against the authoritarian excesses of governments that were often not only authoritarian, but often corrupt and brutal and inefficient, unable to deliver on sort of, tacit bargains that they might have sort of established. being able to deliver something in return for obedience. And that wasn't working, and that seemed to be spreading to Syria itself. And the initial demonstrations, which were met, with uncommon brutality by the Assad regime, I mean, certainly led me to think, well, let's hope that this regime gets overthrown quickly, and hopefully without too much foreign involvement that will contaminate the situation, which will blur the issues. And unfortunately, of course, that is what has happened. It has turned out that this regime was more durable than had been expected. The brutality of it, made one think, well, we really, who would want this crew to remain? But there they are, and the unfolding, or let us say the unraveling, or the failure of an opposition, an authentic and morally sort of defensible opposition, to cohere, to present a message, to organize itself, to have leadership, and so forth. When that fell apart, and it's fallen apart, in a most depressing way, and we still don't know whether it'll eventually come together, but it has led, I think, many analysts to say, well, it's not going to be so simple. There's not going to be NATO or let alone American boots on the ground, as we saw in some ways in Libya, where Gaddafi probably wouldn't have been overthrown without external military intervention. So there has to be a political solution, and that indeed is what Lakhdar Brahimi, whom we know rather well as being Mr. Arab diplomat troubleshooter, who brings more experience and judgment, I think, than any other individual you could imagine. We've talked to him, and in fact we've invited him out to speak in Singapore next spring. And I'm not betraying any secrets that he is extremely frustrated in his mission as the UN's representative. But they are trying, and there will be a Geneva II, and who knows how that will go. But it won't be easy, but it does appear that some kind of an arrangement has to be worked out, which will, first of all, require some rearrangement and sort of renovation of the opposition, and will require some kind of give on the part of the regime or parts of the regime. So the outline of a solution is hard to predict, but one would think that not immediately, but somewhere not too far down the road, Bashar al-Assad has to go. But the question is the state, what's left of the state, and can you separate regime from state in a place like Syria, where it seems to have been, the Mukhabarat security apparatus with certain Alawite and certain Sunni business and certain minority support, that some form of that is not going to go away, and somehow there has to be a shift. I am not optimistic, but this war, as we understand it now, cannot be won. Neither side has the capability to win it. So eventually, and if rationality does prevail at some point on all sides, there will finally be the realization that some kind of compromise is the least bad solution. It may not be it'll be far from good, but at least it will be better than ongoing aimless slaughter and dispersion, which is what you see now.
Yeah. Well, thanks very much for talking with me and answering my
Well,
questions, and we look forward
well,
to talking with you again.
Christina, it was my pleasure, and this is part of what I hope will be a continuing collaboration between the National University of Singapore's Middle East Institute and the University of Arizona's SISMIC.
Great,
So,
thank you.
right, thank you very much.